Long before modern cities, highways, and technology transformed North America, endless forests stretched across the land for thousands of miles. During winter, these forests became almost impossible to survive. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, rivers turned into ice, and heavy snow covered every trail. A single mistake could mean death. For the indigenous Algonquian tribes who lived in these harsh conditions, survival depended on unity. Every family shared food, protected one another, and respected the balance of nature. They believed that greed was one of the greatest dangers a person could face. When someone cared only about themselves, they didn't just threaten their own life, they threatened the survival of the entire community. To teach this lesson, the elders passed down the terrifying legend of the Wendigo. They didn't tell this story as entertainment. They believed it was a warning that every generation needed to remember. According to the oldest traditions, the Wendigo was never born as a monster. It was once a human being. Someone just like anyone else. But during a time of extreme hunger, fear, and desperation, that person made a terrible choice. Instead of protecting others, they chose only their own survival. In the darkest versions of the legend, they committed cannibalism, believing it was the only way to stay alive. The moment that happened, something changed forever. The human soul was consumed by an ancient curse. The hunger that once belonged to an ordinary person became something unnatural. No matter how much food they found, it was never enough. Every meal only made the hunger stronger. Every passing day pushed them further away from humanity. Slowly, their body began to change. Their skin became pale and lifeless, stretched tightly across their bones. Their ribs became visible beneath their flesh, and their eyes sank deep into their skull. Their fingers grew longer, ending in sharp claws, while their teeth became jagged like broken knives. Despite looking as though they had not eaten for months, they possessed unbelievable strength. They could run through deep snow faster than any human, survive freezing temperatures without shelter, and move silently through forests where even experienced hunters struggled to walk. But the most terrifying part of the curse was that the hunger never ended. Every victim the Wendigo consumed only made it larger. Every life it took made the curse stronger. It wandered endlessly through the frozen wilderness, searching for another victim, knowing that nothing could ever satisfy its endless appetite. For the Algonquian people, this wasn't simply a monster story. The Wendigo became the symbol of what happens when greed, selfishness, and cruelty replace kindness and compassion. It reminded people that the greatest monsters are not always born. Sometimes they are created by human choices. As the years passed, the legend spread across different tribes. Each community described the creature a little differently, but every version carried the same warning. Some believed it stood taller than the trees, while others described it as an impossibly thin figure hiding between the shadows. Some said its eyes glowed like burning coals, while others believed its face looked almost human, making it even more disturbing. Yet every story agreed on one thing. If the Wendigo entered the forest, no one wanted to be there after sunset. As darkness covered the forest, everything became unnaturally quiet. The wind stopped. The birds disappeared. Even the wolves, animals that feared almost nothing, were believed to avoid certain parts of the wilderness. The elders used to say that when the forest suddenly becomes silent, it isn't because nothing is there. It's because everything knows something dangerous has arrived. Hunters who spent weeks in the frozen wilderness passed down strange stories that sounded almost impossible to believe. Many claimed they constantly felt as though someone was watching them from deep within the trees. No matter how many times they looked over their shoulders, they saw nothing except endless snow and rows of silent pines. At first, they blamed exhaustion. Then they blamed fear. But the feeling never disappeared. As the days passed, strange signs began to appear around their camps. Fresh footprints surrounded the area where they had slept. The tracks looked almost human, but they were much larger than any person's footprints. Even stranger, the prints often appeared only a few meters away before suddenly disappearing, as though whatever had made them had simply vanished into the air. Some hunters refused to continue their journey after seeing those tracks. Others ignored the warning. According to the old stories, those who ignored the signs rarely returned home. Night was said to be the most dangerous time. As the campfire burned lower, people reported hearing slow footsteps circling them in the darkness. Crunch. 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 The sound of heavy feet pressing into the snow. Whenever someone grabbed a torch and looked beyond the trees, there was nothing. Only darkness. Only silence. Then came something even more terrifying. A familiar voice. Someone would suddenly hear a loved one calling their name. The voice sounded perfect. A father would hear his son. A hunter would hear his closest friend. A woman would hear her sister crying for help somewhere among the trees. Every instinct told them to follow the voice. But the tribal elders gave one rule that every child learned from a young age. Never answer. Never follow. Because the voice didn't belong to the person you loved. It belonged to the Wendigo. The creature was believed to imitate human voices with terrifying accuracy, drawing people farther and farther into the frozen wilderness until they were completely lost. Some survivors later claimed the voice changed as they walked. At first it sounded close. Then suddenly far away. Then behind them. Then beside them. As if something invisible was playing with them. Hours passed. Energy disappeared. Fear took control. People became confused, unable to tell which direction led back home. The freezing cold slowly drained every bit of strength they had left. That was exactly when the Wendigo was believed to attack. Not with a loud roar. Not by charging through the trees. But silently. Without warning. Some legends claimed victims never even saw the creature clearly. They only remembered a tall shadow standing between the trees. Two glowing eyes staring through the darkness. And a feeling of unbearable terror before everything went black. Whether these stories were real or not, they spread across countless communities for hundreds of years. Parents warned their children never to wander into the forest alone. Hunters avoided certain areas after sunset. Travelers stayed together because they believed isolation made a person far more vulnerable. Over time, these terrifying tales became deeply rooted in the culture of the northern wilderness. But then something happened that made even skeptics stop and pay attention. The legend was no longer being told only around campfires. It began appearing in real historical records. For many years, people outside the indigenous communities dismissed the Wendigo as nothing more than folklore. Explorers, traders, and settlers often laughed at the stories, believing they were simply old legends created to frighten children. But as more people traveled through the remote forests of northern Canada, strange reports began to appear. Experienced hunters spoke of seeing a tall, skeletal figure standing motionless between the trees. By the time they blinked or raised their rifles, it had disappeared without leaving a trace. Others described hearing footsteps that matched their own pace for hours. Whenever they stopped walking, the footsteps stopped too. Whenever they started again, the unseen follower continued just beyond the darkness. Some explorers even wrote in their journals that they felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, despite finding no sign that another person was nearby. Then came the disappearances. Small hunting parties occasionally entered the wilderness and never returned. Search teams often found abandoned campsites where food, weapons, and supplies had been left behind, but there was no sign of the people who had owned them. In a few cases, strange footprints were reported near the camps. Some witnesses claimed they looked human, while others insisted they were unlike anything they had ever seen. Of course, many of these disappearances could easily be explained. The northern wilderness is one of the harshest environments on Earth. Blizzards can erase tracks within minutes, freezing temperatures can kill in a single night, and wild animals are always a danger. Yet those who believed in the legend argued that not every case had such a simple explanation. As these stories spread, the image of the Wendigo also began to change. Some artists portrayed it as an impossibly thin giant with glowing eyes and claws. Others imagined it with the skull of a deer, enormous antlers, and a body that looked more like a demon than a human. Although this version has become popular in movies, books, and video games, many indigenous elders explain that the original legends never described the Wendigo with antlers. They say that image was created much later by modern popular culture. The traditional stories describe something far more disturbing. A creature that still looked disturbingly human. A face twisted by endless hunger. Bones visible beneath pale skin. Long arms hanging unnaturally low. Sunken eyes filled with madness. A mouth that never seemed able to close because of its razor-sharp teeth. The horror came from the fact that it looked like a human being who had completely lost every trace of humanity. That image haunted generations of people living near the great northern forests. Then, in the late 19th century, a shocking criminal case emerged from the Canadian wilderness. The details were so horrifying that newspapers across the country began linking the tragedy to the ancient legend of the Wendigo. For the first time, the myth was no longer just a frightening story passed down by tribal elders. It had become connected to a real man. And one of the most disturbing murder cases in Canadian history. The winter of 1878 was one of the harshest anyone could remember. Heavy snow buried the forests of northern Canada, rivers froze solid, and entire hunting routes disappeared beneath thick layers of ice. For families living deep in the wilderness, every day became a fight for survival. Among those struggling through the brutal winter was a Cree trapper named Swift Runner. To everyone who knew him, he appeared to be an ordinary man. He had a wife, children, and experience surviving the unforgiving wilderness. Nothing about him suggested that his name would one day become one of the most terrifying in Canadian history. When winter finally ended, something was terribly wrong. Nearby communities noticed that Swift Runner was alive and in surprisingly good condition. But his entire family had disappeared. When people asked what had happened, his answers kept changing. At first, he claimed they had died from starvation during the long winter. In such harsh conditions, that explanation seemed believable. However, experienced hunters quickly became suspicious. Food could still be found within traveling distance. A government supply post was located not impossibly far away, and several families in nearby areas had survived the same winter. The story simply didn't make sense. Authorities decided to investigate. What they discovered shocked everyone. Near his camp, investigators found the remains of his wife and children. The evidence revealed that they had not simply died from hunger. They had been killed. Even more horrifying, parts of their bodies had been consumed. The case horrified the entire country. During questioning, Swift Runner eventually admitted to killing his own family. The confession spread rapidly through newspapers, and almost immediately people began connecting the crime to the ancient legend of the Wendigo. Many believed he had become possessed by the creature's curse. Some claimed he had transformed into a Wendigo in spirit long before the murders took place. Others believed the endless hunger described in the old legends had driven him completely insane. Of course, investigators treated the case as a horrific criminal act rather than proof that a supernatural monster existed. But for many indigenous communities, the tragedy reinforced a warning their ancestors had shared for centuries. The Wendigo was never only about a creature hiding in the forest. It was about what could happen when fear, isolation, and desperation destroyed a person's humanity. The story of Swift Runner became one of the most famous examples ever linked to the legend. Yet it wasn't the only case. Over the following years, doctors, missionaries, and government officials began reporting something even stranger. They encountered people who insisted they were becoming Wendigos. These individuals claimed they felt an uncontrollable desire to eat human flesh, even when food was available. Some begged to be restrained before they harmed anyone. Others believed an evil spirit had already entered their bodies. These disturbing reports would eventually give rise to a condition that psychologists and historians still debate today. A phenomenon that became known as Wendigo Psychosis. As more of these strange cases were recorded, doctors and researchers began asking a disturbing question. What if the Wendigo was more than just a legend? Not because a supernatural creature existed, but because the fear of becoming one was so powerful that it could take over the human mind. This idea eventually became known as Wendigo Psychosis. It was described as a rare psychological condition reported in some indigenous communities living in the remote forests of northern Canada and the Great Lakes region. People affected by this condition often believed they were transforming into a Wendigo. Some became terrified that they would lose control and harm the people they loved. Others claimed they felt an unbearable hunger that no amount of food could satisfy. The most frightening part was that many patients knew these thoughts were wrong. They cried. They begged for help. Some even asked to be tied up because they feared they might attack someone without warning. Missionaries and doctors who documented these cases were shocked by what they witnessed. Several patients refused to eat normal food, insisting that it tasted like nothing at all. Others became convinced that an evil spirit had entered their bodies and was slowly replacing their humanity. As fear consumed them, they withdrew from their families, avoided other people, and spent long periods isolated from everyone around them. Modern psychologists have debated these reports for decades. Some believe Wendigo psychosis was a real culture-bound mental disorder, shaped by extreme isolation, freezing temperatures, starvation, and deeply rooted spiritual beliefs. Others argue that many historical accounts were misunderstood, exaggerated, or influenced by cultural differences between European observers and indigenous traditions. Even today, there is no complete agreement among experts. What everyone does agree on, however, is that extreme hunger, loneliness, fear, and harsh environmental conditions can have devastating effects on the human mind. The brain can begin to misinterpret sounds. Shadows appear to move. Voices seem real. The feeling of being watched becomes overwhelming. In a place where endless forests stretch for hundreds of miles and winter nights seem never-ending, the line between reality and imagination can become frighteningly thin. Perhaps that is one reason the Wendigo legend survived for so many centuries. It wasn't simply about a monster hiding in the darkness. It reflected the very real dangers of isolation, desperation, and losing hope. As time passed, the legend spread far beyond the forests where it was born. Books, horror films, television series, and video games introduced the Wendigo to millions of people around the world. But in the process, something important was lost. The original meaning of the legend slowly faded away, replaced by terrifying monsters designed only to scare audiences. The true story behind the Wendigo was far deeper. And far more disturbing. Today, the Wendigo has become one of the most recognizable creatures in horror culture. It appears in movies, television series, novels, comics, and video games, often as a giant monster with antlers, glowing eyes, and supernatural powers. Millions of people know its name, yet very few know the story behind it. For the indigenous communities where the legend began, the Wendigo was never meant to be just another scary creature. It was a warning. A reminder that the greatest danger doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it grows quietly within the human heart. The legend teaches that greed can become endless. Power can become addictive. Fear can destroy compassion. And when a person stops caring about others, they begin losing the very thing that makes them human. That message remains just as powerful today as it was hundreds of years ago. Our world may no longer be covered by endless frozen forests, but people still struggle with selfishness, obsession, and the desire to take more than they need. In many ways, the Wendigo has become a symbol of those darker parts of human nature. Even now, experienced hikers and hunters who travel through the remote forests of northern Canada sometimes tell strange stories. Some describe hearing voices where no one could possibly be. Others report feeling as though unseen eyes are following every step they take. Many of these experiences can be explained by isolation, wildlife, harsh weather, or the powerful effect of fear on the human mind. But not every question has a clear answer. Every year, mysterious sounds, unexplained disappearances, and unusual encounters continue to fuel the legend. Whether these stories are caused by nature, imagination, or something we still don't understand remains a mystery. Perhaps that uncertainty is exactly why the Wendigo refuses to disappear. Legends survive because they make us question what we believe. They force us to ask whether every story has a logical explanation, or whether a few mysteries are destined to remain unsolved forever. So the next time you find yourself walking through a silent forest, and the wind suddenly stops, listen carefully. If you hear someone calling your name from somewhere deep among the trees, you may want to remember the oldest warning ever told. Don't answer. Because according to the legend, some voices were never meant to be followed. And some myths are terrifying because they might contain a small piece of truth. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's darkest legends, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe? Was the Wendigo only a myth created to teach an important lesson? Or is there still something waiting in the frozen forests, hidden where no human dares to go alone?